Let's stay in the nation's capital now and catch up with federal Liberal MP Tim Wilson, who heads up the Standing Committee on Economics in Federal Parliament. Just on that, Tim Wilson, as a Melbourne MP, I read some reports out of Melbourne today. Chinese restaurants in Chinatown in Melbourne, a drastic drop in trade. Obviously, the disease has been contained in Australia, only those 15 cases, other people in quarantine before they come back into the country. Obviously, you'd support what the Prime Minister's saying, that around the country people ought to get back to those Chinese restaurants, and you know, the concern was understandable, but we should, of course, make sure that these businesses don't go bust in the meantime.
100%, Chris, and I mean, obviously the travel ban is in place. We're frankly very fortunate that we can be in the position where we both have secure borders but be in a position to stop people coming if they pose a risk. But Australians have got to get on with their lives on a day-to-day basis, and there's no reason to believe there's any risk. I went to a Chinese restaurant last Sunday, or last Saturday I should say correctly, for lunch, and it was a wonderful meal. I had a fantastic time with excellent company, and I would encourage other people to do so as well as their whatever appetite takes them, because we need to get on with our lives, and it would be terrible if businesses sunk as a consequence. I've
got to say, especially with some clowns getting out there suggesting there's some sort of racism at play here, it's largely members of the Australian Chinese community that have been staying away from these establishments as well. So we've all got to recognise the level of risk here and the measures that are in place, and try and look after that side of it. Now, you would have heard my editorial then about the submarine issue. This has got a long way to play out, and Melissa Price says once the design is complete, then we'll look at making sure that we get decent Australian content requirements into the contract. But really concerning if Australia doesn't get to supply at least half of the jobs and contracts that go into this massive project.
Well, we all want Australian components to be going into these major projects, particularly as a central part of our security. But I think we also need to be mindful that decisions around these projects are made based first and foremost about making sure that the input is related to fit for purpose, to make sure that the subs can do their jobs, and we're going to seek to make sure that those components that can be secured from Australia will be, and that will continue to be the case, and the Minister made that very clear today, and that's frankly what Australians expect. We all expect Australian parts and components to be part of this project, as well as part of making sure we have defence investments that actually submarines that work and do the job we need them to.
But there are already people losing their jobs in Adelaide now as they scale back, waiting for all this to work to crank up. It just shows how hard we've made this for ourselves as a country by taking so long to make the decision, and by going for, you know, making a French design that has to be converted from nuclear to diesel electric. There are a lot of very informed critics who suggest this has just been the wrong decision, and the delays and cost blowouts are going to be with us for a long time to come.
Well, people always have their views about what the best way forward is. The reality is the government makes information and decisions based on the advice of obviously our defence forces in making sure that we get the defence capability we need for the country within the constraints that exist, and so I've no doubt the decision was made as fast as it could be in the best interest of the country with the consultation and advice of the Defence Forces.
Now, I wanted to ask you about superannuation. In your home state of Victoria, the Premier Daniel Andrews is talking, actually his Treasurer, isn't it, Tim Pallas, talking about increasing compulsory superannuation to 15%. You know, now I thought 12% was a stretch for the private sector in particular, but he's talking about 15%.
Well, personally, I see this as a complete ambit claim by the Victorian government. They want to lock in the 12%, and so they're going out even further so that it means like it looks reasonable. The practical reality is the 15% is nowhere achievable, in my opinion. In addition to that, we've had the Reserve Bank, the Treasury, the Grattan Institute, ACOS come out and say that ultimately this will come at the expense of people's growth in their wages. So the plan of the Victorian Andrews Labor government is to make Australians poorer.
Just on that, to me it highlights one of the great inequalities when it comes to wages in this country, and that is that public servants already get 15% superannuation paid in. They're already more than 5% ahead of most private sector workers. That's a rort, isn't it? But we're stuck with that forever, presumably.
Well, I'd be a hypocrite if I said it was a rort, because parliamentarians are basically on the same deal. But make no mistake, I'm quite happy to cash in and go down to the standard rate as everybody else and just convert it to salary, which is precisely highlights the point. It's about total remuneration. And so every time you increase the super guarantee, what you actually do is lower Australian wages and wage growth. So Daniel Andrews' plan is actually about making sure Australians are poorer and take home less pay.
Now, where are you when it comes to ideas about, especially for lower income earners, getting rid of that compulsory superannuation component, actually being able to take that as cash in their pay right now?
Well, I've never floated that proposal. I know one of my colleagues has, but I don't think it's the solution to the challenge we face. The challenge we face is to make sure that we have an opportunity to grow people's wages, to make sure people can retire with security. And what we're seeing is more and more data coming out raising question marks about the consequences of what happens when you go down that path. So all I've ever done is wanted to make sure we have a proper discussion. That's obviously what the Retirement Income System Review is doing, and I look forward to its recommendations around what type of retirement system we need, what we need to get there, but also to make sure that we have the levers in place so that people aren't either over-investing or things like superannuation become a pathway to reduce people's tax obligations.
Tim Wilson, thanks for joining us.
Thanks.